Okay, so this week is our first of two movies in a row on the African continent. I wanted to kind of briefly discuss the history of the region that Algiers is in here, the capital of Algeria. It's on the north coast of Africa. The settlement in this area dates back to the Phoenicians, it looks like, and then it was kind of taken over by Carthage and then by Rome. And then that city didn't seem to have lasted through the Muslim conquest, at least, in the same, it didn't seem to be a continuous city, but a new settlement was set up in roughly the same area in the 10th century by the Muslims, and then that kind of went through varying degrees of control from Sicilians and Spaniards, and then back to the Muslims. It was in the 16th century that the Ottoman Empire took it over and held it until the French, who are going to play heavily into this week's episode, took it over from the Ottomans in 1830. So the Battle of Algiers in the title of the movie refers to the conflict in the 1950s when the native Algerians basically are trying to wrest, not necessarily wrest control, but basically gain their freedom, gain their independence from the French. And it's a clone of something like When the Shanks the Barley, with the native Algerians trying to shake off the shackles of the French, and ties into a larger push in Africa in general at this time, and we'll get to next week with Lumumba. But basically, after World War II, all over Africa, they were trying to throw off the shackles of imperialism. And we're going to see that this weekend next. So this is a movie I had seen before. What did you think of Battle of Algiers?
I really liked it. I had never seen it before. But yeah, it was good. I didn't know anything about this period of history in Africa, which that's probably my own fault. But yeah, this episode and looking ahead to next week's episode with Lumumba, I watched them both as a double feature.
Oh, nice.
And then, doing all the research is like, oh my gosh, there's just so much that I was not aware of.
Correct. And we can blame society and public education and honestly just kind of, this Western centrism that is just kind of inevitable. And, hey, public education only has so much time, so they're going to focus on what's near you and what affects you. Yeah, it's just kind of, but again, I think we see echoes of these things kind of throughout the world, and we always talk about how everything kind of ties together. So getting into the movie itself, first on the Oscar side of things, I just looked this up. I thought it was kind of odd to note that, so it was nominated for 3 Oscars, but in 2 different years.
How does that work?
So I don't feel like it would happen anymore today, but it's kind of been just looser in the past, and especially when you throw in the best foreign film category. So at the 67 Oscars for like the 66 movies, of which this is one, it was nominated for, but did not win, best foreign language film. And then 2 years later, it gets a best director nomination and a best screenplay nomination, not winning either. So it must have had to do with somehow their timeline and eligibility, but I don't know how it skipped a full year, so I didn't have time to look into the details of how that all played out. And I do think other movies, especially in the foreign category, have gone through similar oddities over the years. But yeah, so it was nominated for 3 Oscars, and those were 2 years apart. And just because you love you some John Williams, it's worth noting that not John Williams, but Ennio Morricone.
Yes, I was going to bring this up. I have a whole thing in notes.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get to that. Yeah, go ahead and get to Morricone now, or Marconi, however you say it.
I think it's Morricone because it's Italian.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah, Ennio Morricone. He's another powerhouse composer, man. He's definitely not a household name.
Close to it because of Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But yes, not quite.
Well, right. But, only if you, kind of already are into movies and stuff.
No, true. That's true.
However, you've almost certainly heard something that he's done. I mean, he's composed scores for, this, The Battle of Algiers, but, yeah, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. All 3 of those movies he did. Cinema Paradiso.
Oh, man.
The Untouchables, Mission to Mars, The Thing, the John Carpenter version.
Right, from the early 80s.
Yep, he did the score for The Hateful Eight.
And that's where he finally won his Oscar. Do you see that?
And so in addition to doing the score for The Hateful Eight, Tarantino uses music from other movies that he's scored in his own movies all the time, which is actually how I realized, before even looking this up, that Ennio Morricone was the composer well, it's kind of how I stumble onto this whole thing, is because I recognize the theme for the movie, The Battle of Algiers, that it's like a very bum 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 bum.
Oh, you're right. There's a Tarantino vibe there.
From Inglourious Bastards.
Oh, and I didn't even make that connection, but you're absolutely right. And somehow I missed. Like, I was like, I went through different stages here. I was like, oh, he's still alive? Oh, he did Hateful Eight? Oh, that's where he won his Oscar? So I want to say I missed this, but honestly, I'm sure I just forgot because I would have watched the Oscars when he won, and it just somehow didn't register enough that I remembered, 3 years later, that was how it played out. But yeah, definitely an iconic composer.
A ton of different people have, cited him as an inspiration for their work. Everything from Hans Zimmer, obviously another film composer, but even like Metallica. There's a whole section on his Wikipedia page for use of his work from movies in other movies. And it's like everything from like The Simpsons to all the Tarantino movies, Jackass. Like it's he's way more ubiquitous than you would think. And one of those things where it is almost a certainty that listeners have heard something of his and just didn't realize that was his music.
And just in general, I think even as a movie lover, something I've probably underestimated or underrated is the importance of music in movies. And if you don't think it makes that big a difference, try watching a big cinematic action scene and mute it. Star Wars is actually, it was back to John Williams, but a huge example of that. I mean, the early cuts of Star Wars they say were trash before they had these special effects and the music. They said Star Wars was a train wreck, and so it can completely change how you view a whole movie is the sound that goes with it. And I was actually just listening to another podcast talking about the importance of the Hans Zimmer score in Dunkirk and how little talking there is, and the music kind of carries the whole thing. So it's super important. And yeah, coming back to this movie here, you're right. It just kind of has this. I definitely like it better this second time around, and the music is definitely a huge part of keeping you engaged with this black and white movie from the 60s.
Yeah, the music from the movie, it's one of those things where you hear it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is like so stereotypical 1960s war movie music. But like Ennio Morricone is like the dude that came up with that style of scoring that then everybody else was copying.
Right. He's not ripping somebody off. He's the guy.
Right, yeah.
It's like we talked about with Casablanca and the quotes. Yeah.
Exactly.
Same thing here with this movie and the music from Morricone. And crazy that he's still working. He's actually older than John Williams. Like, I kind of just assumed he was dead.
Well, I mean, he's in his 90s, so.
Well, true. Okay, so to the movie itself, and it does a pretty good job of paralleling the history. There's definitely a few tweaks, but for the most part, this is a pretty faithful depiction of the events of the Battle of Algiers. And they just kind of round some things for simplification purposes, but they do a really good job. And again, very, very similar to what we talked about with When the Shakes the Barley and probably other episodes where you're dealing with Revolution is it's complicated because you're dealing with both sides of this, and in many ways, they're kind of painting the quote-unquote terrorists as the protagonists, and you're not rooting for them because they're killing civilians, but at the same time, they're obviously the oppressed, and this is their only way that they see to fight for their freedom, and it's complicated. Yeah,
it's one of those things where there's honestly, there's no good guys and bad guys in this movie. The French, they see that Algeria is, this is a French territory, this is French, it basically is an extension of France, which I think legally or whatever it was, at least in France's eyes, they considered it an extension of French territory.
Yeah, it was part of their country, yeah.
So they're, fighting for their country, and then you have, the FLN who is doing terrorist attacks and blowing up civilian targets, which is very obviously bad. But at the same time, then the response to that by the French is to, round up these dudes and start torturing them to try and parse out the organizational structure, which is also very obviously bad. So yeah, it's kind of
which is kind of what led to the public perception kind of ultimately seems to have turned against the French in this conflict because of their use of torture and kind of laying down the hammer. And again, no one was supporting what the terrorists were doing, but France ended up looking like the bad guy here because it was very obvious that these people didn't want them here anymore. And again, they've been there since 1830. And it kind of to your point, and I don't know if it was technically, what we would consider like another state, but it was definitely considered French turf more than, say, like when we look at India being under Britain. This is even more directly like just an extension of France.
Right. So I read that. So France, I guess, controlled Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria at this time. And Tunisia and Morocco were more like protectorates.
Okay.
And a little bit more independent. Like, we're still kind of considered their own countries. But Algeria was, they called it French Algeria.
Right.
And it was basically an extension of France. Like, this is France just like France is France.
Gotcha.
As far as,
Yeah.
control over that territory.
Right. And of course, then you have, I don't know how many thousands, if not millions, of people who were genetically French, or they're either not just expats and people, or you wouldn't call them expats, so they're, if it's actually still an extension of France, but people who were born here, and they called them basically the Blackfeet, the Pied Noir, where they're born here, they're native to Algeria, but they're French biologically compared to like the native Algerians. Right.
The figure that I had seen is, or by the 1950s when this conflict started, it was over 1 million European French in Algeria.
Okay, there you go. Right.
So a sizable portion of the population.
Right. So it focuses around a specific, and again, I feel harsh calling him a terrorist, but that's what he is at the end of the day, even if he's considered a patriot by the Algerians, if that kind of makes sense.
Well, and to be fair, yeah, we're not just calling them terrorists because they're doing terrorist-like stuff. They refer to themselves as terrorists in the movie.
No, right. And that's the term that's kind of been...
Ali Laplante and one of the other leaders of the FLN, which is the National Liberation Front, they're talking about, the attacks because they're attacking civilian targets. And the guy says, this is what we have to do to basically get attention on an international stage. Like, we have to do terrorist attacks or else no one's going to pay attention, basically.
Right.
He even, it's in French, but he uses the word terrorist. At least the word terrorist shows up in the subtitles.
Terrorist.
Yeah. Oh, actually, no, it wasn't in French. That scene would have been, it was in Arabic. But
true, because they go back and forth. Yeah. And the word terrorism has kind of been not turned exactly, but just the connotation post 9/11 in the United States is you kind of forget that it refers to a tactic. Like, it's a way of, I don't want to say a way of fighting per se, but it is a way of disrupting. And it's typically a resort of those who don't have the means to otherwise fight. So we can't beat you on the battlefield, so we're going to just terrorize you because that's all we have. So whether that's assassinations, which they do a little bit in the movie. When they start assassinating cops, is that like one form their terrorism takes?
So that was kind of the impetus for the military being brought into Algiers.
Yes.
Was they were just going around. Literally just every chance they got, or as much as they could, they were killing the French cops in Algiers.
And what the movie doesn't show, but there was also not just shootings and explosions, but also like throat slittings and beheadings that are not included in the movie. So it was definitely harsh, and then the French response was equally but differently harsh.
Yes.
So yes, in the movie, it kind of is bookended by the arrest of Ali Lapointe, as you just mentioned. Basically, just kind of a young guy who was recruited into this FLN. The kind of it's the National Liberation Front, but then when you turn it to French, the acronym becomes FLN. And he was kind of recruited in and was part of that and setting up these bombings. And so then it flashes. So they kind of in the movie have him cornered behind a wall, and they're kind of saying, hey, come out. And then it flashes back to a few years earlier where they kind of show him getting started. Man, the scene that kind of stands out, both the first time I saw it and this time, more than anything else, and this is less about Ali himself, but when they have the 3 women that they recruit to be suicide bombers, or actually not suicide bombers, just bombers. Because the women can get past these checkpoints. So as the attacks have kind of started, and the French have started, cordoning off different parts of the city and trying to just ramping up security. There's all these checkpoints now, and women just have a much easier time getting through the checkpoints. So they recruit these 3 women. Yeah.
That was in real life too.
No, that's accurate. Yeah, like this happened.
They regularly used, almost exclusively used women to set bombs like that because of the ease that they had getting through checkpoints, and they just weren't well, yeah, number one, they call it sexist or misogynist or whatever, but the French, soldiers were like, oh, well, it's just a girl. What's she going to do?
Right, right.
So they wouldn't really worry about them. And also, which I think they actually touch on in the movie, they didn't understand very much about Algerian culture, but they did understand that it was like not cool for, French males to be, searching or touching females.
Oh, right,
And so they,
right.
they were like, well, let's not cause a fuss. Let's just let the girls through. They can come through the checkpoint, no problem.
Right. They even show one of the guards, flirting with one of the girls who says she's going down to the beach or whatever, and they're kind of like acting like,
Right,
oh man,
yeah.
we wish I could go, and she's carrying a bomb. And the other one that uses her, who brings her little son along, because again, if I look like I'm, an active mother, obviously I'm not up to anything, but then she drops the kid off and then drops the bomb off somewhere else.
Yep.
And then again, those kinds of things were happening.
Oh, going back to the that first scene at the beginning of the movie where they're talking to Ali through the wall,
Yes,
trying to get him to come out, and everyone's like holding their breath and trying not to be heard. Maybe make the French think that they're not behind the wall. I got serious Inglourious Basterds vibes from that too.
I guarantee it's not a coincidence. I mean, Tarantino's all about borrowing those scenes from classic movies. Absolutely, yeah, good call with the music and everything too. That's definitely. I mean, without knowing 100%, I know 100% that Tarantino has seen that movie.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But anyways, yeah.
And then at the end, when they finally do have him cornered and they show it again, how they take him out in the movie is actually what happened in real life. And part of what kind of contributed to the martyrdom and mystique of Ali Lapointe is they end up just, when he doesn't surrender, they say, okay, if you don't surrender, we're going to blow this whole building up. So they do. They don't surrender. They blow the building up. That's how he and the people with him were killed. And again, makes the French look bad, makes this guy even more of a hero and kind of someone who was willing to die for the cause of Algerian freedom. That's basically the movie.
Right. During this conflict, and when it started, the French government was not even hesitant. They would not refer to or consider this conflict a war, because a war is between two countries or between two distinct groups of people.
Oh, interesting.
And in the eyes of the French, if they said, well, this is a war, then that would mean that Algeria wasn't actually part of France, that it was Algeria or a different country. So they viewed this is almost like entirely a, domestic...
An internal conflict. Right.
A domestic internal conflict. The other thing that got them was when they would capture FLN fighters, they weren't European French, so the French didn't consider them French citizens. So they weren't afforded any of the protections of like French civil law, but they also weren't POWs because it wasn't a war. So the French didn't consider them prisoners of war. So they didn't fall under the Geneva Convention either, which basically let the French military do whatever they wanted with anybody that they captured or anybody that surrendered to them. Which in most cases ended up with them just killing them or torturing them.
Okay, so yes, the resolution of the conflict does tie into Charles de Gaulle and the establishment of the Fifth Republic in France. So I had to definitely research this to kind of get it all straight in my head, because it's not at all straightforward. And because this is so a quick recap, and this is going to date back to the French Revolution. So basically, France was a monarchy forever with the kings and queens, and then when the whole Reign of Terror and French Revolution came and they ended the monarchy, they established the first French Republic, because it was not a monarchy anymore; it was now a republic. But then that was, famously unstable and leads to Napoleon taking over as emperor, which ends the First Republic. Okay? So after kind of Napoleon coming back and forth and the reinstitution of the monarchy for a little bit, several decades pass here. And then in 1848, they established the Second French Republic, which only lasts for a few years before Napoleon III names himself emperor, before kind of fading away by 1870 with the Franco-Prussian War and everything. Anyway, the empire falls again, and they establish the Third French Republic in 1870, and that continues up through World War II until basically France was conquered by Germany, and you kind of just have Vichy France during the war. The Fourth Republic comes back after World War II and is basically just a redux version of the Third Republic, just with the World War II just kind of being the dividing force there. Now, where de Gaulle comes in, and it ties into what France saw as their failures in World War I and World War II. And obviously, as Americans, we are very much on the side that we see a lot of jokes about, teasing the French over the world wars. And they kind of saw it that way too, to a point where they felt that the lack of a strong central leader was maybe something that didn't give them the versatility or the strength to kind of act quickly enough, and to kind of basically, they wanted to have a stronger France, and de Gaulle led the push for that, meaning a stronger president. And then so that was kind of already the sentiment, and then we had this conflict in Algeria. It was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, although it was by no means a straw. It was a very big deal, and it basically led to the collapse of the Fourth Republic in 1958, and the establishment of the Fifth Republic with a very strong executive branch that it lacked before. And so, and as it extends to today, so President Macron right now in France doesn't have, there's still, the parliament and the prime minister and stuff, but he's a little more autonomous than even the American president as far as what he's allowed to do within the country there. So it's almost like France temporarily elects a little mini king as their president. So he's a very, very strong executive. So then in 62, under the Fifth Republic with de Gaulle, they are able to kind of put an end to this conflict, but it is kind of by ultimately separating ties. And it was still, though, a huge mess, because now you have so many refugees that are trying to get out of Algeria, and France way underestimated that, and that kind of causes this crisis with, I think it was like 900,000 people trying to come into France in the 60s after this. So they kind of just spent a long time dealing with the aftermath of that. But then Algeria did become an independent country. Shoot, that's essentially it.
This is kind of a side note, but this conflict is kind of, again, like what we're going to be talking about next week with Lumumba, and then also all the anti-imperialist stuff going on in Central and South America that we were talking about with Che Guevara and the Motorcycle Diaries. They also mention, I think it's the French colonel mentions Indochina, which is a reference to the conflict in French Indochina, which was kind of a precursor to the Vietnam War. But basically, after World War II, in what is now Vietnam, which was called French Indochina at the time, there was another conflict similar to this one where France was fighting a war basically to try and hold on to one of its kind of colonial territories. And they ended up losing, because Vietnam is obviously its own country today. But yeah, just a little history side note there. That was just the last thing that I had written down in my notes that I hadn't touched on yet.
Okay, so yes, we will continue our journey in Africa here next week with the 2000 film Lumumba.